What occurs when a fairy tale prince from yesteryear shatters his fabricated facade and begins racing through horrors and offenses as if they're utterly ordinary? Whether it's deception, theft, brutality, deceit, child exploitation, or even betrayal against the crown. Stick with this video to the finish to uncover the real reasons folks despise Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew entered the world in a fortress where gilded barriers guarded him from repercussions. At 65, the meticulously built facade surrounding him has crumbled, and the individual once shaped to embody the royal family's dashing warrior now represents its most mortifying liability. He's conceded, without uttering the phrases outright, that global opinions were spot on from the start. The controversies that trailed him from adolescence weren't fabrications, not overzealous critics losing their minds, but alerts the royal household disregarded. Prior to Prince Andrew ever stepping onto an aircraft, clasping a palm, or confronting disgrace, he was a lad convinced regulations applied solely to lesser mortals. By 65, as society compels his realities into the open, it's evident he didn't turn vicious. He was nurtured in the gloom of ruthlessness, permitted to mock, incite, and overpower without fallout. One of the initial tales that disrupts the narrative emerged from Windsor Castle. Per biographer Ingrid Seward, around 5 years old, youthful Andrew strolled into the stable area where sentries and stable hands labored in silence. He ridiculed the guards on watch, jeering at their rigid stance. He booted the canines. He brandished rods at the steed's limbs. When the stable attendants urged him to cease, he rebelled. Ultimately, 2 exasperated stable hands hoisted him bodily and hurled him into a heap of excrement, piling manure atop him. Degradation, certainly, but also an instruction in limits and outcomes, save that no one enforced it. No one demanded this entitled youngster reform, yet that was merely the onset. On a different instance, young Andrew provoked a valet so intensely that the valet, defying all etiquette, retaliated. He smacked Andrew, bestowing a shiner. The prince sprawled on the ground, dazed, hemorrhaging, his guardian incensed. The valet proposed resignation, anticipating discipline. The queen declined. She deemed Andrew deserved it. The valet remained. The youngster who could endure a strike, yet stay protected, absorbed something hazardous. Your authority resides in goading others. Your advantage in enduring their strikes. These youthful episodes weren't solitary pranks. They resemble foretelling outlines of how Andrew would act under global scrutiny. The lad who derided guards at 5 evolved into the gentleman who insisted drapes be pulled exactly, plush toys positioned precisely, personnel petrified by trivial errors. The youngster whose visage was marked by a valet transformed into the grown-up scarred by phrases, media releases, refutations. In the early 1980s, as Princess Diana mesmerized the globe with her allure and purity, Andrew was cultivating a vastly contrasting notoriety. He was intended to be the magnetic junior son, striking in regalia, the unmarried royal whose liaisons would thrill the masses. Instead, he grew notorious within royal confines as indulged, haughty, and disturbingly juvenile. Domestic personnel portrayed him as exacting to the extent of harshness, commanding them with the presumption of someone deeming himself superior to all, a deity syndrome. Charlotte Briggs, an ex-chambermaid, disclosed how Andrew once bellowed at her for permitting a minor slit in his drapes, degrading her over a blunder unnoticed by others. This conduct wasn't sporadic. It was habitual. His sleeping quarters brimmed with stuffed creatures aligned in meticulous sequence. If attendants shifted a cuddly bear or neglected to arrange them per his exact blueprint, he erupted in juvenile fury. To outsiders, it appeared quirky. To those laboring beneath him, it was maltreatment. A mature male of 35 hurling fits like a 5-year-old. His mother pardoned him. His father, Prince Philip, dubbed him the backup, a fellow fated to rank second to Charles, yet liberated from the obligations the throne required. That liberation nourished a gloomier facet of Andrew's character. As he matured, the populace labeled him Randy Andy. Unlike his siblings, more prudent with the media, Andrew reveled in his libertine image. He wooed starlets and mannequins, paraded his opulence, and conducted himself as impervious. When he wed Sarah Ferguson in 1986, the enchanted narrative disintegrated swiftly. Their union was demolished by controversy, with Ferguson ensnared in compromising scenarios while Andrew persisted in his own heedless conduct. They separated, but their peculiar intimacy post-divorce stoked further gossip. To the monarchy, Andrew was no longer a dependable emissary of the crown, but an erratic encumbrance. The 1990s intensified the decay. While Britain endured economic slumps and frugality, Andrew jetted globally on public funds. He garnered the moniker Air Miles Andy for his lavish utilization of choppers and chartered aircraft, draining millions from taxpayers. Periodicals unveiled his expenditure patterns, his extravagant getaways, and his misuse of his armed forces' role for privileges. The populace grew more furious, querying why this individual, who fulfilled scant substantial roles, was siphoning funds while typical households strained. He scorned the censure, convinced his rank rendered him exempt. What no one grasped was how profoundly his hubris would ultimately plunge him and the monarchy into disgrace. Within the palace, whispers amplified. Personnel observed his fixation with prestige emblems. From the quantity of decorations affixed to his attire to the females he was spotted with in night spots and eateries. He was frantic to be revered, but incapable of meriting esteem. Companions started terming him credulous, readily swayed by adulation, and eager to ally with anyone granting him the mirage of significance. This defect would subsequently become the linchpin to his demise. By the late 1990s, Andrew's vocation as a naval commander had concluded, leaving him questing for purpose. He was designated a commerce ambassador intended to enhance British enterprise overseas. Instead, his position morphed into another fiasco. Accounts emerged of his bonds with tyrants and entrepreneurs of dubious repute. Divulged U.S. consular dispatches depicted him as conceited, impolite, and contemptuous, mortifying British functionaries who collaborated with him. He had converted the position into a stage for his individual connections, bartering on his regal title for entry and benefits. The royal who once epitomized martial order now symbolized avarice and venality. The media ridiculed him incessantly, but Andrew still bore himself with smug assurance. He possessed one safeguard, the monarchy's safeguard. The Queen sheltered him, settling his obligations, mitigating his fiascos, convinced her offspring's honor merited safeguarding. But behind Buckingham Palace's drapes, the personnel had already deduced what the populace was merely commencing to surmise. Andrew was not merely callow. He was perilous to the crown's endurance. His self-centeredness was limitless, his actions imprudent, and his cohort of associates increasingly noxious. If you deem that's insane, then you'll gasp when you learn that Ghislaine Maxwell presented him to Jeffrey Epstein. Andrew perceived solely the extravagance, the chartered aircraft, the opulent residences, and the entry to mannequins and luminaries. What he failed to perceive or opted to overlook was the price of that camaraderie. Epstein was already murmured in elite spheres, notorious for conduct that ought to have alerted any honorable gentleman to flee. But Andrew didn't flee. He embraced it. He was blinded by covetousness and prestige. The individuals who had borne his ire, his haughtiness, and his presumption knew precisely why. He had perpetually been this way. The populace would subsequently be appalled by the snapshot of Andrew with his limb encircling Virginia Giuffre's midriff, a juvenile, and Maxwell beaming in the backdrop. To the globe, it was astounding. To the palace personnel, it was validation. The gentleman they served, the one who shrieked over drapes and plush toys, who commanded submission, who strutted through existence without remorse, was now unveiled in the most repulsive manner conceivable. This was merely the prelude. Now you'll learn the particulars. Agonizing, revolting particulars. Hope you're prepared for it. By the close of the 1990s, Andrew's notoriety had deteriorated so severely that even palace confidants began querying his prospects. His separation from Sarah Ferguson in 1996 ought to have been a fresh commencement. But instead, it inaugurated a novel phase of mortification. Merely months afterward, snapshots of Ferguson having her digits licked by her fiscal consultant splattered across sensationalist papers. The fiasco sullied both, but Andrew's reluctance to detach from her perplexed the masses. He resided with her intermittently for years post-separation, fueling suspicions that the duo were monetarily intertwined in manners they never wholly clarified. Meanwhile, Andrew immersed himself further into the existence that garnered him the title Randy Andy. His liaisons with starlets, mannequins, and socialites were chronicled nearly weekly, but his conduct appeared increasingly frantic. At one juncture, he was rumored to have courted Caprice Borat, a liaison that dissolved amid mockery. The once dashing royal was aging poorly in public perception, derided as a middle-aged fellow clinging to his youthful libertine persona. When the Queen designated him as Britain's special envoy for international commerce and investment in 2001, many hoped it would bestow him dignity. Instead, it granted him license. In concept, he was intended to unlock opportunities for British firms abroad. In reality, he transformed the role into his personal realm. He soared on chartered jets, lodged in sumptuous inns, and encircled himself with contentious entrepreneurs. Accounts emerged of him befriending Muammar Gaddafi's offspring, Saif, and other despotic personas, prompting queries about why a senior royal was cozying up to autocrats. Divulged American diplomatic missives in 2010 affirmed what functionaries had been stating for years. U.S. envoys portrayed Andrew as brash and discourteous, a fellow who nearly bordered on rudeness when debating anti-corruption strategies. At one luncheon in Kyrgyzstan, he astounded U.S. and British functionaries by ranting about journalists and lecturing them on how regimes should disregard public sentiment. Instead of projecting British principles, Andrew embarrassed them with his haughtiness. But his gravest defect wasn't haughtiness. It was his incapacity to resist adulation. Entrepreneurs swiftly realized that a few compliments could secure them access to a British royal. Andrew forged alliances with Kazakh tycoons, vending his residence, Sunninghill Park, to one for €15 million, which was €3 million above its listed price. The abode remained vacant and decaying thereafter, confirming suspicions that the transaction was a dubious favor rather than a legitimate deal. Queries about finances orbited him perpetually. Where was he acquiring his fortune? And who was bankrolling his opulent existence? It was in this atmosphere that Ghislaine Maxwell intervened, presenting him to Jeffrey Epstein. To Andrew, Epstein was ideal, affluent, networked, and capable of providing the glamorous existence Andrew yearned for. Epstein proffered what Andrew had been losing for years: significance. The royal who was fading into derision abruptly had entry to New York's power circles with mannequins, luminaries, and tycoons. He didn't inquire about Epstein's history, or perhaps he didn't care. What mattered was that Epstein treated him like royalty, even when Britain no longer did. Andrew's sojourns to Epstein's estates became habitual. Flight records later showed him traveling on Epstein's chartered jet. Witnesses recalled spotting him at Epstein's New York mansion. Snapshots depicted him strolling with Epstein in Central Park, even after Epstein had served incarceration for sexual offenses. The Globe was astonished that a senior royal would associate with a convicted sex criminal. For Andrew, it was routine affairs. He dismissed Epstein's offenses as inconvenient whispers, convinced his own title could withstand any fiasco. But then arrived the snapshot. In 2001, a 17-year-old girl named Virginia Giuffre alleged she had been trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell and coerced into sexual encounters with influential men. One of those men, she stated, was Prince Andrew. The snapshot showed him grinning in a London residence, his limb draped around her bare midriff, Maxwell beaming in the backdrop. To Andrew, it was a minor, forgettable instant. To the Globe, it was condemning. Andrew refuted everything. He insisted he had no recollection of encountering her, even as the snapshot proved otherwise. He claimed he had never been upstairs in Maxwell's residence. He said he had no reason to associate with Jufrey, but his justifications rang false, and each refutation deepened the suspicion that he was deceiving. The palace hurried to contain the narrative, but it only expanded. Journalists unearthed more particulars of Andrew's camaraderie with Epstein, including the fact that Andrew lodged at Epstein's New York mansion after Epstein's conviction. To most folks, it was inconceivable that a royal would step foot in the abode of a man convicted of trafficking juveniles. To Andrew, it was nothing more than a convenient lodging. As more women came forward against Epstein, Andrew's name was reiterated in judicial filings and news accounts. The palace attempted to isolate him from the fiasco, but it was too late. The man once derided as a spoiled, irrelevant libertine was now connected to one of the gloomiest criminal webs of the contemporary era. His conduct, once dismissed as haughtiness or quirkiness, was suddenly viewed as perilous.